Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to cut through the noise and really zero in on the core insights of topics that matter. Today, we're taking that deep dive into the, well, sometimes fascinating, sometimes maybe a bit intimidating world of economics. Okay, let's try and unpack this a little. If you've ever been curious about how economies work, everything from why your grocery bill changes week to week, right up to things like national unemployment rates, but maybe felt a bit swamped by all the jargon, well, this deep dive is definitely for you. Our mission today is pretty straightforward. Explore the two fundamental branches of modern economics. That's microeconomics and macroeconomics. We're going to clarify what they actually are, where they came from, and maybe most importantly, show you why getting a handle on these two perspectives is absolutely key to seeing the economic world around you with, well, much greater clarity. Think of it like getting two essential lenses to view things through.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here, I think, is how these distinctions, which might seem purely academic, actually shape how we understand almost everything. From your everyday personal finances, the choices you make, right up to those big, sweeping changes in global economic events and the major decisions governments grapple with. It really is about having the right lens for the right picture. We'll explore what each one reveals.
Okay, good. So let's start right at the core then, this foundational split. Microeconomics and macroeconomics. They're the two main branches, and their names actually give us a pretty big clue about what they study. The term micro, that comes from the Greek word micros, meaning small, or even, get this, a millionth part.
A millionth part, yeah.
Tiny. And macro, as you might guess, comes from the Greek makros, which just means large.
Yeah.
Simple enough. But when did economists really start drawing this clear line, giving them these specific names?
Right. Well, the credit for actually coining these terms, micro and macro, largely goes to a brilliant Norwegian economist, Ragnar Frisch. He was at Oslo University. He introduced these terms back in 1933. And Frisch, he was a major figure. He was actually a joint winner of the very first Nobel Prize for Economics back in 1969.
Wow, the first one.
Yeah, and he was also a pioneer of something called econometrics. You can sort of think of that as the data science part of economics, using math and stats to see if the theories actually match up with the real world. So his work wasn't just about sticking labels on things. It was really about creating a much more robust framework for rigorous, systematic economic analysis. He gave economists the language they needed to talk clearly about studying the parts versus studying the whole thing.
That really sets the stage nicely. Okay, so let's take a quick sort of historical detour. How did these two branches actually develop over time? Because you said micro came first.
Well, microeconomic analysis certainly developed first, yes. It's often seen as the kind of traditional approach. You can trace its roots way back to the classical economists.
Yeah.
The big names like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, J.S. Mill.
The founders, basically.
Pretty much. But it was really popularized, brought into the mainstream, you could say, by a neoclassical economist, Professor Alfred Marshall. His book, Principles of Economics, which came out in 1890, was hugely influential. Marshall really built out the framework for how we think about individual markets, supply and demand, that kind of thing. Others contributed too, of course, like Pigou, Hicks, Samuelson, Joan Robinson.
Okay, so micro was developing its analytical tools, but what about the big picture? Was anyone thinking macro back then?
Well, yes and no. Macroeconomic ideas, thinking about the economy as a whole, were definitely around much earlier. You go back to the 16th and 17th centuries, you had the mercantilists trying to figure out national wealth.
That's hoarding gold and all that.
Sort of, yeah. And then the 18th century physiocrats in France, they analyzed national income too. Even the classical economists we just mentioned, Smith and Ricardo, they touched on national income. But here's the key thing. Their macro-level analysis, their big-picture thinking, it was generally sort of mixed in with their micro-studies. It wasn't a separate, distinct field of analysis in the same way. So for a long time, microanalysis basically ruled the world of economics.
Until
the Great Depression, the 1930s. That was the real turning point.
So if microeconomics was the dominant way of thinking, what exactly happened during the Depression that made economists realize they needed something else? A bigger lens.
That's exactly it. The traditional micro framework, which really emphasized individual markets finding their own balance, self-correcting, it just couldn't explain what was happening. It couldn't explain the sheer scale, the persistence of mass unemployment, the collapse of entire economies. Individual firms might have been making what seemed like rational choices for themselves, but the whole system, the aggregate, was clearly broken.
And that's where Keynes comes in.
Precisely. This is where it gets really interesting. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes published his incredibly famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money.
Hmm.
And Keynes, he specifically used a dedicated macroeconomic approach. He looked at the big aggregates, total demand, total employment, to analyze these massive economic problems.
Yeah.
So, yeah, most of the credit for building this modern macro approach, it really goes to Lord Keynes. He gave us the tools to analyze the entire forest, not just focus on the individual trees.
Okay, that's a fantastic overview of the history. So now we have these two distinct branches. Let's zoom back in with that first lens. Let's really dive into microeconomics. Remind us again, micro means small part. So it studies a small part of the national economy. How exactly does it do that? What's it looking at?
Right. It zooms right in on the economic actions and the behavior of individual units. So think about an individual consumer, like you deciding what brand of coffee to buy. Or think about an individual producer, maybe a local bakery, figuring out how many loaves of bread to bake each day. Or it could be the price of one specific thing, like what determines the price of a liter of petrol. Or even a factor of production, like the specific wage rate for, say, a graphic designer.
Okay, really specific things.
Exactly. Maurice Dobb called it a microscopic study of the economy, which is a great description. And Professor A.P. Lerner had this really vivid analogy. He said microeconomics is like looking at the economy through a microscope to see how the millions of cells, the individuals or households as consumers, and individuals or firms as producers play their part in the working of the whole economic organism.
I like that the economy is an organism made of tiny cells. So if we're using this microscope, what are the main things microeconomics is trying to figure out? What's its scope?
It generally covers three main areas, which really help us understand how these individual parts function and interact. First up, there's the theory of product pricing.
Okay, prices.
Yeah, this is all about how the price of a single individual commodity, like that liter of petrol or a loaf of bread, gets determined. It looks at the market forces, specifically individual consumer demand and individual producer supply. Second, there's the theory of factor pricing. This looks at how the inputs, the ingredients used in production, economists call them factors: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, how they get rewarded. So how are rent, wages, interest, and profit determined for these specific factors?
Right, like the wage for that graphic designer we mentioned.
Exactly. The third main area is the theory of economic welfare. This is a bit more conceptual. It's basically asking, are we making the best possible use of our scarce resources? Are we allocating them efficiently to maximize people's satisfaction, their overall well-being?
How do they measure that?
Well, it breaks down into a few types of efficiency. Efficiency in production. Are we getting the maximum possible output from the resources we have? Efficiency in consumption. Are the goods and services we produce being distributed in a way that maximizes total satisfaction for society? And then overall economic efficiency. Are we actually producing the mix of goods and services that people most desire?
So it seems like microeconomics is really focused tightly on individual prices and how resources get allocated at that small scale. Does that mean it just kind of ignores the big headlines like inflation across the whole country or national debt?
That's a really important distinction, yes. Microeconomics, by its nature, deliberately does not study those large economy-wide aggregates. It doesn't really get into national poverty levels or overall income inequality across the country or broad theories of economic growth or those big business cycles that affect everyone.
Things like monetary policy, setting interest rates for the whole economy.
Exactly. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, those are outside its direct scope. Its real strength lies in that detailed, zoomed-in analysis of the individual parts.
Okay, that makes sense. So if it's focusing so tightly on these individual units, how does it actually do the analysis? What are its key tools or methods?
Good question. Well, as we said, its primary focus is the study of individual units. And because prices are so central to how these units interact, it's often just called price theory. Now, when it examines one small piece of the economy, say the market for coffee, it often uses what's called partial equilibrium analysis. Think of it like a science experiment where you try to isolate one variable.
Keep everything else constant.
Exactly. To understand the coffee market, economists using this approach would study its equilibrium, where supply meets demand sort of independently, assuming that other things in the economy, like income levels or the price of tea, are staying constant for that moment.
Ah, the famous ceteris paribus.
Precisely. That Latin phrase meaning other things remaining constant, it's a key assumption. Microeconomics relies on several assumptions like that, often including things like perfect competition or full employment, just to simplify the analysis and isolate the specific effects it wants to study. Another core method is what's called the slicing method. It literally does what it sounds like. It splits or divides the whole economy into small, individual units and then studies each unit separately in detail.
Like taking a slice of one person's income out of the national total?
Exactly. Or studying individual demand for, say, smartphones as a slice of the total aggregate demand for all goods. It also heavily relies on the marginalism principle.
Marginalism.
Yeah, that's the idea of looking at the impact of one additional unit. What's the change in total cost if a firm produces one more widget? What's the change in total satisfaction if you eat one more slice of pizza? This thinking at the margin guides decisions for both producers and consumers.
Makes sense. Deciding if that next step is worth it.
Precisely. Micro also analyzes different market structures.
Right.
How do prices and output differ if you have perfect competition versus a monopoly versus something in between?
Right.
But always remember, it's limited scope. It doesn't really tackle those big nationwide economic challenges directly.
Okay, got it. So let's bring it back to the listener. Why should you care about microeconomics? What's its importance in practical terms?
Oh, it's incredibly important in many ways. First, it helps us understand price determination for all the individual goods and services you buy. Why does organic milk cost more than regular milk? Why did flight prices go up? It's also crucial for understanding how free market economies fundamentally work, where millions of individual decisions by consumers and firms, not central planners, determine what gets produced and how.
So the invisible hand idea.
Related to that, yes. For anyone interested in foreign trade, microeconomics helps explain things like why a government might put a tariff on imported steel and what effect that has on domestic steel producers and consumers, or how the exchange rate between, say, the dollar and the euro affects individual import-export businesses. Businesses themselves rely heavily on micro principles for making crucial business decisions every day. Things like, what's our cost of production? What price should we charge? How do we maximize profit?
Makes sense for business owners. What about government?
Absolutely useful for government, too. When they're framing specific policies, maybe putting a tax on sugary drinks or implementing a price ceiling on rental apartments, they're using microeconomic analysis to predict the effects on specific markets and individuals. It's also the foundation for welfare economics, trying to figure out policies that improve overall societal well-being through efficient resource use.
So it really is the lens for understanding the nuts and bolts, isn't it? The sort of gears and levers of individual economic life in specific markets. All right, let's switch gears now. Let's step back and pick up that wide-angle lens. Macroeconomics. If micro was the magnifying glass, macro is the telescope, maybe, looking at the big picture. So if micro focuses on the small parts, what exactly does macro analyze? What are we looking at now?
Now we're analyzing the entire economy. Forget individual prices or single firms for a moment. Macroeconomics deals with the combined totals of economic activity across the whole system. So we're talking about things like total employment or unemployment in the country, national income, the total income earned, national output, the total value of goods and services produced, like GDP, total investment by all businesses, total consumption by all households, total savings. The general price level is inflation going up or down overall, interest rates across the whole economy. Those big swings like trade cycles, recessions, booms, overall business fluctuations.
So it's fair to say macroeconomics is the study of aggregates.
Absolutely. It's the study of the whole forest, to use that analogy again, rather than the individual trees. J.L. Hansen defined it as the branch that looks at the relationship between large aggregates, like employment volume, total savings, investment, national income. And Professor Carl Shapiro put it very concisely, macroeconomics deals with the functioning of the economy as a whole.
Okay, that paints a clear picture of the scale. So when microeconomists are looking at the whole economy, what are the major themes or theories they focus on? What's the scope here?
Well, its scope is naturally very broad, covering the entire system. But we can break it down into a few major areas. First, there's the theory of income and employment. This tries to explain what factors determine the overall level of national income and total employment. Crucially, it also asks why these levels fluctuate. Why do we have recessions and booms? The roles of aggregate consumption and investment are key here. Business cycles are a big part of this theory.
Okay, income and jobs for the whole country. What else?
Second, there's the theory of general price level and inflation. This looks at how the overall level of prices across the entire economy is determined. What causes it to go up, inflation, or down, deflation? And understanding this is vital because inflation and deflation affect literally everyone's purchasing power. Third, we have the theory of growth and development. This is really important. It explores why some countries remain underdeveloped or struggle with poverty, while others grow richer. And it suggests strategies and policies for accelerating economic growth and improving living standards across the board.
Thinking about long-term progress for nations.
Exactly. And finally, there's the macro theory of distribution. This looks at how the total national income, the whole economic pie, gets divided up among the main factors of production at a national level. What are the relative shares going to wages, rent, interest, and profit in the economy as a whole?
That's definitely a huge shift from the micro perspective. If micro uses that partial equilibrium isolating one market, how does macro analyze the whole interconnected system all at once? What's its approach?
Right, it can't just isolate one part. So, as we've established, its foundation is the study of aggregates. And because national income is such a central concept, it's often called income theory. It dives deep into measuring national income, social accounting, what determines aggregate demand and aggregate supply for the whole economy. And unlike micro's partial equilibrium, macroeconomics typically uses general equilibrium analysis. This approach explicitly tries to look at the behavior of demand, supply, and prices across many or even all markets simultaneously. It acknowledges that everything is interconnected.
Like pulling one string affects the whole web.
That's a great way to put it. It really highlights the interdependence between these big aggregate variables. How does a change in total investment ripple through the economy and affect national income, overall output, total employment, maybe even the general price level? It sees them as linked. Its method, contrasting with micro-slicing, is sometimes called the lumping method. It studies the whole economy by lumping things together into these large aggregates. Professor Boulding had another great analogy here. He said, forest is an aggregation of trees, but it does not reveal the properties of an individual tree. That just perfectly captures the difference.
Seeing the forest, not the trees.
Exactly. Macroeconomics also focuses quite a bit on growth models. It studies the factors driving long-run economic growth and develops theoretical models, like the Mahalanobis model in India, which emphasized investing in heavy industries to build a foundation for long-term growth. It deals, of course, with general price level, that average of all prices. And maybe most importantly, especially following Keynes, it's seen as a very policy-oriented science.
Meaning it's meant to guide government action.
Precisely. A big part of macroeconomics is about suggesting practical economic policies for governments, policies to promote economic growth, generate more jobs, control inflation, or fight off recessions and depressions.
Okay, so macro gives us the big picture and aims to guide policy. Why is this vital for you, the listener? Why should this grand view matter in your everyday life?
Oh, its importance is immense. It helps us understand the basic functioning of an economy as a whole system. How do these huge aggregate variables behave and interact? It's essential for analyzing and hopefully managing those economic fluctuations, the booms and busts in income, output, and employment that impact job security and investment returns for everyone. The study of macro really brought national income accounting to the forefront.
Right.
Without understanding measures like GDP, it's almost impossible for governments to formulate sensible economic policies or even know if the economy is growing or shrinking.
You need to measure it to manage it.
Absolutely. For anyone concerned with economic development, macro provides the tools to understand the challenges faced by developing nations. Things like widespread poverty, deep inequalities, differences in living standards, and it helps formulate strategies for improvement. It also allows us to measure the performance of an economy over time. Are we producing more this year than last year? How does our growth compare to other countries? National income stats help answer that. And of course, it helps us study and understand those crucial macroeconomic variables like inflation, unemployment, and interest rates that you hear about in the news constantly. It gives you that essential big picture context.
Okay, so we have our micro lens for the details and our macro lens for the overview. If we were to just quickly put them side by side, what are the absolute key differences? A quick compare and contrast.
Sure, let's boil it down. Meaning, micro is about the individual unit. You, a firm, one product. Macro is about the aggregates, the whole economy, total output, overall employment.
Got it. Individual versus aggregate.
Tools. Micro uses tools like individual demand and supply curves. Macro uses aggregate demand and aggregate supply for the entire economy.
Okay.
Scope. Micro looks at specific product and factor pricing, individual welfare. Macro deals with national income, the general price level, total employment, money supply.
Different playgrounds.
Importance. Micro is key for understanding price determination, helps individual business decisions. Macro is vital for studying national income, economic development, and guiding government policy. Theory name. Micro is often called price theory. Macro is often called income and employment theory.
Price versus income.
Examples. Micro looks at your individual income or the output of one factory. Macro looks at national income or national output.
Perfect. That makes the distinction really clear.
And the takeaway is you really need both perspectives, right? You need to see the individual trees and understand the health of the whole forest.
Yeah.
They're complementary.
Absolutely. So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening right now? Hopefully you feel you've got a much more solid foundation for understanding these two key lenses economists use. It really is about knowing when you need to zoom in, to focus on those individual decisions, specific prices, single markets, that's microeconomics, and knowing when you need to zoom out to see the economy as a whole system with its broad aggregates, its overall trends. That's macroeconomics.
And maybe this raises an important question for you to think about going forward. The next time you hear a news report, maybe it's about inflation hitting a certain level, or the national unemployment rate changing, or perhaps new government policy on taxes or interest rates. Just pause for a second. Ask yourself, is this primarily about an individual component, a micro issue? Or is it about an aggregate, a macro phenomenon? And how might understanding both the micro and macro perspectives actually change how you interpret what's happening in the economic world around you? How might it change how you think about your own decisions and your place within that bigger picture?
That's excellent food for thought. We really hope this deep dive has given you a clearer, more informed perspective on these fundamental economic concepts. Keep that curiosity going, keep applying these lenses, and we look forward to diving in with you again soon.